As a scientist who's worked in several different fields, I think the core of nutrition science is quite simple. Eat real food, mostly plants, not too much. So why is there so much confusion and debate? Why are most consumers obsessed with protein when most nutrition scientists wish we were obsessed with fiber?
Stop obsessing about protein. Oh my God, so it's not even the plant versus the animal. Your kids don't need more protein.
Thanks to Marion Nestle and her game-changing books, we have a very simple answer. Just follow the money. Real food, mostly plants, not too much. Where's the money in that? Food giants know where the money is. Doritos. Beef.
Beef will always be what's for dinner.
And supersizing us.
I'm surprised at how attracted I am to it. Ba-da-ba-ba-ba.
I think I know something about you. You don't want to believe you're influenced by marketing, am I right? I know I don't. Gah! Unfortunately, the food giants run circles around scientists and you and me when it comes to influencing public opinion and getting your kids to beg you for goldfish. Marion has spent decades of her amazing career figuring that out. I don't think any of us can fully understand the confusion around nutrition without coming to grips with food politics. But what respected scientist would dedicate their career to something that seems so depressing? That question has fascinated me for years, and finally at age 85 and still sharp as a tack, she wrote her biography, Slow Cooked. It hasn't been easy. There have been a lot of tears. Well, hello, Marion. It's kind of amazing. In the last interview I did with you, I posted it on your 85th birthday. And
now it's practically 86.
I know, amazing. Oh, sorry about the squeaking in the background. I'm babysitting some dogs. So anyway, when I commented that it was your 85th birthday, people were shocked. They said she looks 60, 65. How could she be? But you are the ultimate late bloomer, right? The book that launched you published when you were 66, Food Politics?
I'm very old. And I'm about to have another birthday. They do come.
Well, you look great. I noticed in this book you had lots of photos of yourself through the years. And you always look slender.
Yeah, I never had a weight problem.
But your dad was 350 pounds.
Yeah, at least. And he was 5'10" and a 3-pack-a-day smoker. He had what we now understand to be multiple risk factors for coronary artery disease, and he died at 47.
Oh, that's awful. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I mean, he probably had diabetes too, but, they just didn't know about it in those days. And,
I see.
And they didn't know how to treat coronary artery disease. And so, he was in the hospital and in bed for 3 weeks and died at the end of that. And his brother, who also had his first heart attack at 47, lived to be into his 90s because the technology had caught up with it.
Wow.
I don't think that was what caused my interest in nutrition, but there it was. It was a really big influence. He wasn't around much, so he was not an enormous presence in my childhood. He and my mother didn't get along, so he wasn't around much.
You had a rough childhood. It didn't exactly instill confidence in you.
You're right. That was the big problem. I came out of childhood scared to death of the world. So it took a long time to get over that.
There were a lot of factors in there, right? Your beautiful hair.
Yes.
Does it sound creepy if I tell you your hair is beautiful?
Thank you.
It's beautiful. I've always thought it was beautiful.
It was the bane
It never occurred to me that
It was the bane of my childhood existence. It was just torture. All of my growing up, and I think all the way through my 20s, I couldn't talk to my mother without her saying, "Can't you do something about your hair?" And so it's such an irony now that I get stopped on the street and people say, "Oh, your hair is so gorgeous." It's really funny.
It is.
It's funny.
My wife paid a lot of money to get a perm like that several times over, and it didn't stay like yours.
I did try to straighten my hair at one point, but I lost a big swath of it.
One of the quotes that stopped me on page 2 was, "I married at the age of 19. Back then, if educated women worked at all, it was as secretaries, teachers, nurses, or in my case, laboratory technicians."
Yeah, I mean, I grew up in a lower middle class family without any money. I was a child of the Depression. When I went to high school, girls didn't take science classes. I did, but there was no expectation that a female child was going to do anything except get married and have children, preferably as soon as possible. And I went to an academic high school, where everybody went to college, but they didn't stay in college, or they got married after their sophomore year, which was what I did. And because it was socially expected, and I was trying very hard to conform to social expectations. Whenever I had wanted, when I was in high school, to go to an East Coast Ivy League school, I was discouraged by absolutely everybody from even considering it. I wrote for applications, but never filled them out, and I wouldn't have had enough money to go anyway. And nobody suggested that I might get a scholarship. That was never suggested. People would say things like, it's cold there, why would you want to go? And the one person from my high school who had gone to an East Coast school committed suicide the first year. And so this academic high school in which, 90% of the students went on to UCLA or Berkeley or some other school in California, didn't send students to East Coast schools. So I had good instincts, but I had absolutely no encouragement for following up on them, and I didn't have the courage to do it. I knew, later I met people who had the courage to do it, and I was so impressed with them. How did you do that? And they never occurred to them not to have the courage. But I got so much discouragement from not only from my family, but from my school. And I was a good student. So I don't know. That's what happened. I did the best I could. I went to Berkeley. It wasn't so bad.
You had really good grades. You were a good student, but that didn't seem to give you the self-confidence that you...
No, I worked hard. I just assumed that if anybody who worked hard would get good grades, and that the reasons other people didn't get good grades was they weren't working as hard as I was. I mean, they didn't come that easily to me, but I worked at it.
And you got married when you were 19.
Yes. I laugh about it now. Well, I have two wonderful children from that experience, so it turned out okay. But it was certainly not a very sensible thing to do. He was the first person I'd ever dated.
So you went to Berkeley. Nutrition was not on your mind, but you did love food, right?
Well, nutrition would have been on my mind if it had been an option, but it wasn't. The only options for studying food, I already knew I loved food, and my mother had a friend who collected cookbooks. Oh, how I wish I had my hands on those. And she suggested food, but the options were agriculture or dietetics. And agriculture was out of the question. I was a city girl. I didn't know anything about it and didn't figure out until much, much later how important it was to understanding what people eat. And dietetics, I went to school I started Berkeley as a dietetics major. I sure didn't last long. My memory was I was out of it after the first day because it was home economics. And that I didn't think that made any sense for going to college. And I was taking these 5-credit undergraduate chemistry classes with all these pre-med students. I thought if I was going to be taking this level of science class, I probably ought to do more science. So that's what I did.
So did you know about Agnes Faye Morgan? Was she any kind of presence for you?
Not at all, except that the dietetics department was in Agnes Faye Morgan Hall. But I didn't know who she was. And in any case, that was home economics. It was already getting a reputation as something that you might not want to do. Another great irony of my life was that I went to NYU in 1988 to chair a Department of Home Economics. Again, a fantastic irony. So, if I look back and regret anything, it was my lack of courage, which is why I'm so amused when people compliment me on how courageous I am now. And taking on the food industry, and I don't feel like it's courage, but...
I do. I feel like, why aren't they coming for you? They probably have been coming for you for a long time.
If they do it behind my back. I don't have to confront it.
Yeah, now you've risen. I saw you at CNN the other day. There's a new study on processed food I haven't read yet, and there's Marion Nestle commenting on it. You and Walter Willett seem to alternate commenting to the press. That's pretty good company, isn't it? Walter
I think
Willett?
it's good
Haven't you known him
company.
for a long time?
Sure.
So you got your bachelor's degree.
My bachelor's degree is in bacteriology. And that was training to be a lab technician. And my first job after finishing college was as a lab technician. I worked for 2 years after finishing undergraduate and then had my first child.
And then you tried to be a stay-at-home mom. How'd
Yes,
that work
that didn't work very well.
Can you describe what happened there?
I cried a lot. My first child was perfectly happy as long as he had 100% of my undivided attention. I was quite unprepared for that. I was an only child, sort of an only child. So I didn't really have much experience with babies, and he was kind of a shock. He's turned out to be a lovely adult.
How did you get to graduate school? You're at home crying, having trouble being a stay-at-home mom, and then graduate school happens.
I had a friend who listened to me cry all the time and finally said, "This is ridiculous. You should go to graduate school. Train yourself to do something. You'll get a job afterwards. You'll be able to work. You can get your kids taken care of somehow."
You're juggling 2 kids, and you somehow get your PhD in 5 years?
Yeah, that was about.
How?
That was.
Did you sleep?
More or less average. No, I was very efficient. I had 5 hours of babysitting a day. That was all I could afford with my stipend. I went to the lab from 10 to 3. Those were my hours. This was after I had finished classes. When I was in classes, it was much more difficult because they were early in the morning sometimes. If it had to be done in 5 hours, it got done in 5 hours. I didn't mess around much. Then I could have had a science career, I think, if I had been able to pull it off. But once again, it was a question of not having the confidence or the support system to do it, which was really the story of my life up until the time I came to NYU.
Your first marriage dissolved, and you kept your husband's last name, which is kind of ironic that you have the name Nestle,
Yes.
which some people pronounce Nestle. Is she the heiress of the big food giant?
No, I'm the black sheep of the family.
Yeah, the black sheep of the family. So then you met another guy, Zach, and Harvard was recruiting him, so you moved back east and you got a job at Brandeis, right?
Yeah, that was my assistant professor. I was a postdoc there for several years, not a very successful one. And that was the site of what I called the swimming pool epiphany when I realized I couldn't have a career in science and have 2 small children. I just couldn't handle it. And that was a real turning point and very shocking. And the story was that my kids had swimming lessons on a Saturday morning, and their swimming lessons usually lasted 3/4 of an hour, and I'd stay at the pool. But one week there was a double one, and I thought, oh, they're going to be in the pool for an hour and a half. I'll go to my lab and get a little work done. And nobody will be there and nobody will bother me. And I walked into my lab on a Saturday morning and everybody was there. Absolutely everybody. The lab director, the lab technicians, the other postdocs, the graduate students, everybody was there except me. And I hadn't even known that there were people there on Saturday morning. And I thought, oh, okay, now I get why I'm not making very much progress. And now I get why everybody is treating me as if I'm not making very much progress. I don't have a presence. And then I thought, can I be there on Saturday morning? And there was no way I could do that because my husband was also, he was an assistant professor at Harvard and he had his own lab stuff to get done. And there was no possibility of finding a babysitter to take care of my kids on Saturday morning, and they were too young to leave alone. And that was that. That was the end right there. I started looking for teaching jobs and got hired at Brandeis to teach. That was the beginning. That was the end of my laboratory career, even though I had opportunities. I had an offer to do another postdoc with somebody who later won a Nobel Prize. So I was moving in reasonable circles. And again, had very good instincts. I just couldn't do it. And so, up until this point, and we're talking about up into my 30s now, I just didn't have the ability to do what I wanted to because there were so many barriers to it. And then who was going to take care of my kids? I mean, that was a really big issue. So I took a teaching job, and that led to where I am now. So it wasn't so bad.
Well, so it's fascinating how it led to that. But I wanted to ask you a question first. In your in the blurb on Brandeis's page that you cite in the book, you said you teach a lab course that strongly emphasizes analysis of original observations rather than revealed truth. What does that mean?
Well, we did experiments in that lab. The students were crossing fruit flies and dissecting squid and looking at the trees on the Brandeis campus. It was basically a general zoology class and botany, 2 semesters of biological laboratories. And the class was about students doing these experiments and trying to observe what the results were, no matter what the results were that they thought they were supposed to be getting. What results were they actually getting? And they were rewarded for honesty and for integrity. And I thought the labs were really interesting because they didn't always come out the way you expected them to. And there was much to be learned from that. This was real hands-on science. I loved teaching it, and the students seemed to like taking it.
But then a very fateful thing happened. Brandeis had that policy that you hadn't heard of, which is you can teach the same class 3 times, but no more, and then you have to rotate around and teach something else. You got assigned nutrition?
Yeah, I got handed a nutrition. I had been teaching cell and molecular biology, which was interesting but difficult to teach because it's very abstract, and the students, you can't taste it, smell it, feel it, and the students were complaining that they wanted more undergraduate biology that had to do with humans. So they wanted a human biology course. I had taught the cell biology 3 times in a row. It was my time to switch. I was told I could teach human physiology or human nutrition. Which would I prefer? I picked nutrition.
Very fateful. And you fell in love with it right away, right?
Instantly on the first day. On the very first day I started preparing the class, I thought, this is just a wonderful way to teach undergraduate biology because everybody eats and students can relate to it. And you can talk about what's in food that the body needs. You can talk about how digestion works. You can talk about metabolism. You can talk about everything based on something that's extremely concrete that you could taste, smell, and feel. And I thought this would just be wonderful fun to teach, and it certainly was.
Plus, you were a competitive home cooking foodie at UC Berkeley, right?
Yes, I hung around with a group of people. Remember, I love food. I always have right from the beginning. And I hung around with a group of people who were competitive home cooks. I didn't like the competitive part, but I sure liked the results. And, we were cooking out of Julia Child's Mastering the Art of Home Cooking, which is not easy to do. And cooking our way through that long before people made movies about doing that kind of thing.
So then Zach, his time at Harvard expired. He went to UCSF. You went with him. Mm-hmm. You were lucky enough to become an associate dean, although not quite at the status of the men or not near the status of the men. But you had this beautiful office and everything else. And you got to teach nutrition to medical students, mm-hmm. right? You said that the auditorium filled up, with people, they were that interested in it.
Oh, yeah. Oh, people were enormously interested in nutrition, and they hadn't had any. And I was teaching medical students through the first year biochemistry class. But we also, the government offered grants for expanding nutrition education in medical schools, and we got one of those grants. And that paid for a lecture series. It paid for a block elective on clinical nutrition. It paid for a lot of things. And we would fill up the auditorium with lectures on nutrition for the general UCSF community. And I worked a lot with medical students to get that done. It was very gratifying to be able to do that. We had a terrific program going, and then they dropped the grant. Some of the stuff remained, some of it didn't.
Why didn't most of it endure? I commonly hear med students don't get much nutrition class.
There are structural reasons for it. For one thing, it's not reimbursable in the same way that procedures are reimbursable. So this is true of anything having to do with preventive health care. It's a big flaw in our healthcare system, if we had a real system, which we don't. But there are no questions about nutrition on the medical national boards. There's no expectation of nutrition intervention except through surgical rotations with enteral and parenteral nutrition. And those structural problems have never gone away. It was a big issue when I was teaching nutrition at UCSF in the 1980s. There had already been 20 years of calls for more nutrition in medical education. And I wrote a paper for a medical journal just 2 or 3 years ago on nutrition education for medical students. It hasn't changed at all. It still hasn't changed, and it hasn't changed for exactly the same reasons. And now, because of the way the healthcare system works, as a patient, you get 15 minutes with your doctor if you're lucky, and your doctor is sitting in front of a computer. And there's, to think that a doctor is going to have the opportunity to talk to you about what you eat when it takes time to find out what people eat and what kinds of diets they're eating. And even getting doctors to refer patients to dietitians is extremely difficult. So until there are real structural changes, I just don't see, what's going to happen. If we ever get a healthcare system that the government has to pay for, a single payer system that everybody thinks would be more efficient and better, there's no incentive to take care of prevention because all the money is on the other side. So this requires a system change, and those are very difficult to do. And so the first calls for more nutrition in medical education came in the 1960s, and nothing's happened since, really. Some things have happened in some schools, but it's rare. And there are certainly pockets of there are certainly a few medical schools that have very highly functioning programs where they're training doctors how to cook and teaching them about food and trying to teach them about the reality of the way people eat so that when they're confronted with a patient who's overweight, they can handle it in a reasonable way, and not tell the patient, lose weight, thank you.
The consumer perception on the internets and so on is that doctors just don't care about, and medical schools just don't care about nutrition. This is one of the things I find so fascinating about you, your blog, Food Politics, your books and so on, is you can explain why that is so. It's a structural problem. It's not that they don't care. I'm assuming that's what you're saying.
Yeah, they don't have the time. They really just don't have the time at all. The ones who are really interested will ask patients to fill out a questionnaire. But it's very hard to know how accurate the information is in questionnaires about diet. Patients tend to, it's just human to want to please your doctor because you're very dependent on your doctor for lots of things. And so you want to give the information that you think is going to go over better. And, there's now tons of experience that says you've really got to probe dietary questionnaires and ask a lot of cross-cutting questions that will give you a better idea. So that you can't even get an idea of what people's caloric intake is on a daily basis, or what the main sources of their calories are, which is what's really critical for overweight. So it's kind of hopeless. What can you do in a 15-minute interview? It's really tough.
You began writing a book in 1983. You published it in 1985, your first book, on nutrition in clinical practice, right?
Yeah, I wanted to write a book for medical students who didn't have nutrition instruction, because it was already obvious that, oh my goodness, you've got a copy of that? That's amazing. That's an
Not only that, but I've read it.
That is an antique. I wrote it because there was no nutrition in medical practice, and I wanted to, it's little teeny essays about everything, anything any medical student needed to know about nutrition at the time. Every now and then I pick it up and read it and think, gee, this isn't half bad. It's a little out of date.
No, I read it prior to this interview, because in your book you said, well, it's out of date now, or dated or something, some language like that. And I thought, this will be interesting, because she's used to being the professor and grilling the students. I get to grill her on on what stood the test of time and what didn't. And, it's not half bad.
It's not half bad, right?
It's great, actually.
There are a few
and you would call it not half bad.
Yeah,
or were
there's
there
some
a few cringeworthy
things that I would change, but the things have moved on, and my opinions have moved on. So, I'm much more concerned about calories now than I am about nutrients.
Well, I thought you were pretty concerned about calories back then too, because so I'm looking at a chart on the cause of death and the rank. You rank the causes of death. This is from data in 1981. And you placed an asterisk by the conditions associated with overconsumption of energy nutrients. And you had heart disease as that, cancer as that, stroke, diabetes, atherosclerosis, were all associated with overconsumption of calories. Still are. One thing that looks like it's changed is you had heart disease is 328 deaths per 100,000, and cancer way lower at 184, stroke at 71.3. But those have narrowed, right?
Yeah,
Cancer has increased.
It's narrowed as the cardiologists have gotten much, much better at treating heart disease, and everybody's on statins. And that surely made a difference. And so the cancer rates have gone up or stayed the same, and the heart disease rates have gone down a lot. And of course, COVID is missing from that list now, which is way up there as a cause of death. So those kinds of things have stayed the same. The numbers have changed. I think there was an enormous emphasis on dietary fat at that time. I think that's, now we're concerned about fat and carbohydrates much more. Sugar has become a much more important issue. I would have been much tougher on sugar, I think, if I'd written it now, because at the time, the only concern about sugar was tooth decay.
Wow.
And so that's been a big change.
Didn't Dr. Yudkin at Cambridge publish a book on sugar?
Sweet and Dangerous.
Yeah.
Great title.
Was he just kind of ignored, or why didn't that book get more traction? It's been republished now by...
Yeah, I think there are a lot of reasons, and some people think it's because the sugar industry fought it so hard, but I think it just had to do with the state of the research at the time. And at the time, the research was showing that saturated fat was a much stronger determinant of heart disease risk, because saturated fat raises blood cholesterol levels, and high blood cholesterol is associated with heart disease. And the research was much, much stronger on that point, even though there were flaws in the research and there were questions raised about it. Nobody was talking about sugars in those at that time. And in 1985, I think it was, the Food and Drug Administration came out with a major book-length report on sugar and health, which concluded that there was no evidence for an association of sugar with any other risk factor except for tooth decay. And, we know now that the Sugar Association was really trying to minimize anything about sugar and tooth decay and maybe other things as well. But if there was a large industry presence in trying to manipulate that, it's been difficult to show that. I've not been able to find much evidence for it.
But Marion, in 2016, Bradley Johnston, funded by ILSI, who you've exposed in your blog before, published a paper in the Annals of Medicine saying, oh, come on, sugar, the risks are exaggerated, the evidence was weak. Have your sugar. That was 2016.
Yeah.
And he didn't disclose that he was funded by ILSI. ILSI.
ILSI is what it's referred to, the International Life Sciences Institute, which now has another name because they got such a bad reputation.
Deservedly.
For being shown up as an industry front group. They have some other name now, which I can never remember, the Food and Something Institute. But yeah, there's still a lot of industry funding, and there's now a big push from journalists and physicians against sugar, and the what I call the sugar is poison crowd. And I think everybody would be healthier eating less sugar. It's got calories and no other nutrients. In small amounts, I think it's okay, but in sodas, not so okay. I wrote a book called Soda Politics because sodas are the main source of sugar in American diets, and drinking your sugar is not such a great idea.
So it would seem that you had a pretty good life. You're associate dean at UCSF. You have a new book out that's respected, but then your marriage to Zach ended. You turned 50. Your position at UCSF ended. You run a department in San Francisco and asked how you got yourself in this terrible mess. Your kids were grown up and gone. Mm-hmm. And was that the darkest period of your life?
I think so. It really was. It was the first time in my life I've ever been depressed. I'm not a depressive type. And, I moved to the last block of houses in San Francisco on the West End, so I was looking out on the water. It was gorgeous there. And I thought, well, if I'm going to be depressed, I'm going to be depressed in someplace beautiful. And once again, somebody said, go back to school. You don't have, I was fired at UCSF basically. And once my marriage broke up, because my job there was as a wife, an accompanying spouse. Once the marriage broke up, there was no reason to keep me. And a new dean came in and made my life miserable, kept moving my office further and further away from the corridors of power.
Down into the parking garage.
Basically. We didn't talk about my office, which had this breathtaking view of the West End of San Francisco. It was just every day that I walked into the office, I gasped because it was so beautiful. And I kept being moved into uglier and uglier offices, finally into the basement of the parking garage, as a symbol for all of that. And I was stuck. And Phil Lee, who was the head of the Public Policy Institute at UCSF, was somebody who had always been very kind to me. I went to him and burst into tears, which is what you're not allowed to do at a medical school. I still can't believe it.
And you said you couldn't stop.
Oh, I couldn't stop. It was uncontrollable. And he heard me out and said, oh, you've got to resign. You have to resign. You can't stay in that office. This was a political appointment. I didn't understand that. This was a political appointment. Political appointees have letters of recommendation on the desks of the person who's coming in, so that when they come in, they decide whether to accept your resignation or not. And you hadn't given him that opportunity. You got to get out of there. And then, so that made me cry more. And then he said, and here's how you do it. And this was revelatory to me, that you could negotiate this kind of thing. Now I understand that everything at universities is negotiable. There is not anything that is not negotiable. And he said, you go to the dean and tell him that you understand it's not working. I think you should go to public health school. You need a credential. Go get a credential. And tell him you need 2 years to do it. and that he should pay you a salary for the next 2 years, and that 2 years from whatever date that is, you're out of here. And that's when I got up the courage to do it, I did that. And, I'll never forget it. He looked at me, kind of stunned. It took him about 10 seconds to figure out what a good idea it was. And he said, I'll talk to the business manager about it. And by the time I got back to my office, which could not have been more than 10 minutes later, there was a phone message saying that this was a really good idea and a letter would follow. And part of it was I was the only woman on the senior staff. And it didn't look good. And I was the only one without tenure. So it didn't look good that he was firing me. So I saved him an awkward situation by resigning. And so I resigned, moved out of the dean. I was out of the dean's office in a minute. And I went back to public health school. That's what I did.
That was the one time you had the advantage of being a woman, right?
That's right.
I think you said that in your book.
That's right. It was very advantageous at that moment. It seemed, I felt like I was jumping off a cliff. I was pretty terrified. Would I ever get another job? Why was I going to public health school to get a credential? I already had a doctorate.
Yeah, why were you?
Because he advised it and because I didn't know what else to do. And because the public health school was so welcoming. Yeah, you should come to public health school and you should get a master's in public health nutrition. And they were really welcoming about it. They thought it was just a terrific idea. So that's what I did. And it was a terrific idea. It was just a wonderful thing to do. I had a great time.
And you got exposed to things you hadn't been exposed to before, like feeding the homeless, right?
Right. Yeah, you had to do an enormous amount of field work as part of the program that I was in. You had to work for a year, for the semesters, with some nutrition service agency of some kind. Homelessness was new. Everybody had just been thrown out of mental hospitals. And all of a sudden, San Francisco was confronted with, for the first time, with people sleeping on the street. And I got in touch with the Coalition of Homeless Shelter Providers and worked with them for a year on the nutrition programs that they were offering. And that meant soup kitchens, it meant food banks, it meant a lot of meetings with street people and working with people with women, young mothers in a hotel where homeless women were housed. So I got to see what that looked like, and it didn't look good. I thought we could do much better.
I tell you, if there's one thing I may take away from your book is the benefit you got from getting a therapist. I've never had a therapist, but I spent 3 years on the streets with my mom, homeless, when I should have been going to elementary school. And Mom, I adored her. She had that master's degree from Cornell. She was very bright. She was in cancer research. She had a great career. And then age 35, when she was pregnant with me, she came down with a horrible case of schizophrenia, adult schizophrenia, and got terrified by the McCarthy era, and the communists were out to get us, and they would steal me. And
I'm losing
so she pulled me out of school. Yeah, and she pulled me out of school, and we lived on the streets of Oakland for 3 years. But the one thing that she said that terrified me is if the truant officer ever caught me playing hooky, I'd go to San Quentin for life. And I didn't know what that was, and I didn't want any part of it. So I stayed out of sight from any police officer or anything.
How old were you at the time?
2nd through 5th grade.
Oh, my goodness.
Man, I need a therapist. Work for Marion. Maybe I needed.
I was very fortunate in my therapists, and I sure needed them.
Well, and you used a therapist all the way when you were at NYU and you're retiring.
Oh, I needed it badly at NYU. Oh, did I need it? Oh, did I need help? I knew I needed help, and when at that point in San Francisco, when I was fired from medical school in San Francisco and was trying to put my life back together, I knew I needed help. And and I had a friend who was a very close friend, who's still a very close friend, who's a psychiatrist, and she couldn't do it because we were friends. And so she recommended a therapist in San Francisco who was very helpful in just looking at things in a different way. Just having somebody to listen to what I was going through and have an outside person look at it from a different perspective was extremely useful. And I did that there. And then when my marriage broke up, there was couples therapy for a while. And then when in Washington, where I was having so much difficulty with the person I was working for, and everybody in my office had difficulty with this guy, but it was much worse for me than it was for anybody else. And I could see that other people were handling it so much better than I was. I tried to get a therapist, but everybody in Washington told me they had nobody to recommend, that it just wasn't a good place for talking to people about secrets. But the minute I got to New York, I found a therapist.
So we did a little leap there, and not to lose our viewers. You got a job for the feds working on the Surgeon General's report. That's why you were in Washington, right? Can you describe that?
Yeah, I was in public health school, and I had promised to leave the UCSF on October 1st, 1986. That's when the 2 years that the dean had given me had run out. And I needed a job starting October 1st, 1986. And the only one I got was this one in Washington, which was in the Office of Disease Prevention and Health Promotion, editing the Surgeon General's report on nutrition and health. The Surgeon General at the time was C. Everett Koop, a fundamentalist Christian who, it turned out, had very strong moral fiber and was somebody that everybody respected enormously. Although I didn't have very much to do with him, it was very nice to be associated with him. But the office was a very difficult place for me to work, in part because the person I worked for had a management style that involved criticism and no praise. And that reminded me so much of my mother. One of the things I got out of doing this book was realizing, no wonder I had so much trouble with him. He was just like my mother. So I had a pretty hard time with it, but was able to get it done. And it was a very useful thing to do. I learned a lot. Well, I vote for Washington experience for anybody who's interested in policy. You want to know how it works, you got to go to Washington and see how things work in practice. I was always in trouble the entire time I was there. I was just always getting into trouble because you're supposed to be not politic and bipartisan if you work for an agency, nonpartisan if you work for an agency. And, I had strong feelings about what I was doing and what I wanted the Surgeon General's report to say. And that was difficult. But it got done. And then I got the NYU job as a result.
I noticed in your book you said that when you were an undergrad and you fulfilled all the requirements for graduation, you explored other classes like French Revolutionary History and politics and things like that. And then when you got to Brandeis and you were teaching, you taught out of a book. What was the title of it? It had to do with people not...
Oh, Food for People, Not for Profit, the collection of short essays that the Center for Science and the Public Interest published in the early 1970s. A terrific book.
So it seems like you were drawn to these things, politics and food for people, all your life. But then what's fascinating is the way you describe the wording you had to give to the Surgeon General's report. Like you can't say eat less meat, you have to say eat less saturated fat, because eat less meat was a call to arms. To me, it's just so confusing because to the consumer, they understand what meat is. Saturated fat, is that some biochemical term? What's saturated? Double some hydrogen?
Right. You switch to nutrients when you talk about what people are supposed to eat less of. because the government cannot be in the position of telling people not to eat foods that are manufactured by United States businesses. And the meat industry has been very powerful in keeping the government from saying anything about eating less meat, even though it's clear that eating less beef would be very good for planetary health, if not human health. So yeah, the euphemisms were built in, and I was not allowed, after researching and actually doing a lot of the writing on the report itself, I was not allowed to write the executive summary. And the one part about the Surgeon General's report that, makes me kind of, even today, was its main message, which was to eat less fat. And I don't remember putting up much of a battle, because I do remember not feeling like I had much of a opportunity to battle about that. But I was worried about calories. And there are calories from carbohydrates too, and those count. So I would have done it in a somewhat different way, but everybody was talking about saturated fat at that time. It wasn't just the Surgeon General's report. The National Academy of Medicine came out with an enormous report 6 months later that said basically the same thing. That was kind of the state of understanding of the research at the time. And it wasn't until the Snackwell's cookies started coming out with no fat and loaded with sugar that everybody caught on
That's
to
my
what a
text
mistake
tone. Oh
that
yeah, my
was.
baby's calling. That's my wife. I have my phone on Do Not Disturb, but for her, I take the text messages. Yeah, and you also said that you couldn't recommend eating less of foods that contained sugar or salt.
Yeah, you couldn't recommend anything that had to do eating less of any kind of food that was manufactured in the United States. Because the makers of those foods would get very upset. They would go to Congress. They give a lot of money to Congress. Congress would intervene. And that was pretty realistic, I thought.
You've written about guidelines like in Canada, and I interviewed Pekka Puska for Finland. It doesn't seem quite as vicious in those places. It just doesn't seem to be quite as much industry influence. But you've said in Canada there's still industry influence, even though they try to prevent it. But is the U.S. like one of the worst countries for this, or?
Oh, it's hard to know. Certainly of the countries where there's enough transparency so you can see what's going on. I think we have a captured government now. That industry has captured government, and it's not just in food, it's in everything else as well. And it's a huge problem in our society, is that there's no independent pushback from agencies, and that corporations are allowed to do pretty much anything they want. That's a political problem across the entire spectrum of business, and I think it results from business imperatives, not only to make profits, but to grow profits. And with respect to the food industry, because food is so overproduced in the United States, the food industry is especially competitive because it's hard to sell products when there's so much food around. So they have to work doubly hard to sell their products and to make sure that there's no regulation that might make people eat less of their products. And the most profitable products are the ones that people should be avoiding.
Doritos.
So that's a problem, and not one that's easily solved.
So then at age 50-something, after that experience with the feds, you got your big break.
Yeah, I got hired at NYU. That was the best thing that ever happened to me. I didn't know it at the time because I was recruited at NYU to chair a Department of Home Economics. I could hardly believe that a Department of Home Economics still existed at a college, because by that time, this was 1988, by that time, opportunities for women had opened everywhere. And the department looked like it was something out of 20 or 30 years earlier. It was, really poorly maintained, and the physical facilities were shabby and looked terrible. And the department didn't have sort of the most basic things that you would expect of universities in 1988, like computers. There was only one faculty member who had a computer when I came. And I had been using a computer for nearly 10 years by then. Transcripts were still written by hand. I mean, it's hard to explain how antiquated the whole thing seemed. And I had been brought in to change the department and bring it into the 20th, if not the 21st centuries. And so there was a lot of tension over that. It was not easy, and I was very happy to find a therapist instantly because it was clear I was going to need one.
So speaking of tension, I was quite surprised when I read the top endorsement on your book that's behind me. You can't see it, but people will see that on the shelf. The top endorsement is from Julia Child,
Oh, you're not afraid of a little flame, are you?
who didn't have a very high opinion of nutritionists in the day. And she made you a steak dinner, right?
Oh, this is my famous dinner with Julia. You know, I mean, I've already told you that we cooked from mastering the art of French cooking in my competitive home cooking days. And of course, I watched her on television and admired her extravagantly. And I was hanging around with a group called Old Ways Preservation and Exchange Trust, which was a food organization that was very interested in food for health and sustainability, and took groups of academics and food writers and other chefs all over the world to eat fabulous food. It was really a wonderful, wonderful organization at the time, and it did wonders for me. And I met one of the people who led that organization, Nancy Jenkins, who was a food writer. And she said, if Julia meets you, maybe she'll change her mind about nutritionists. I thought this was a little optimistic because Julia was famous for saying that nutritionists had ruined food for America, that the focus on reducing fat had taken all the joy out of food, and that nutritionists didn't like food, and there was nutritionists were promoting canned vegetables and frozen vegetables. I mean, she was just absolutely appalled by the whole thing. And so Nancy thought, well, if Julia meets me, she'll change her mind. So Nancy arranged this dinner, at which Nancy ended up not being able to come because she had broken her foot. And so there I was at this dinner party, facing Julia on my own with some other people who were there. And she just seemed really resentful of having me there, and was not very welcoming, and in fact was rather cold, and then plunked down the largest steak I had been offered to eat for as long as I could remember. I do eat meat. I just don't eat a lot of it. And this was a lot. It was very delicious, but it was a lot. And she said, there's nothing like I can't imitate her. I really can't. But there's nothing like a good steak, is there? And I thought, oh, dear. Okay. The daggers are drawn. And it was a very difficult evening. But things got much better afterwards. And, that she did a blurb for Food Politics was extraordinary because she doesn't blurb books. And her agents arranged it. I was enormously grateful. It really meant a lot.
And she was a late bloomer too, right?
Yeah, and not as late as me, but she was a late bloomer.
Yeah, but didn't she get into TV in her 50s or something, and people thought, you're crazy, especially the men?
The BBC's making docs about prize-winning scientists while we're peddling cookbooks.
She was so absolutely endearing.
Feels flimsy to me. This is public television, for God's sake.
Shouldn't we go with someone with a more camera-friendly look and a less distinctive sound?
And real. She was, you talk about authenticity. She was absolutely authentic on TV, and she was absolutely authentic in person. She was really uncomfortable about being put in the position of having to make dinner for a nutritionist. And we didn't know each other, and we had no, basis for any kind of relationship. And I had brought my copy of Mastering the Art of French Cooking with me to have her sign it. And this book is worn. I don't know how else to put it. It's got singed pages. It's got pages that are stuck together with hollandaise sauce. It's got, it was clearly a book that was heavily used, and I thought that would impress her, but it didn't. She wrote me something that was kind of stiff and not very warm on it as I was leaving. But really, things got much better afterwards. When we started food studies at NYU, all was forgiven. By that time, things were much better, and I have a whole collection of, she wrote lots and lots and lots of little postcardy notes. I have my collection of them. By the end, things were much better.
And didn't you go to a 90th birthday celebration of her in Santa Barbara?
No, it wasn't. It wasn't in Santa Barbara. I went to her 80th.
Oh,
and that was in New York. I didn't go to her 90th.
I see. So somewhere along the line, so that was a tenured position at NYU.
Oh yes.
So we could finally see Marion unleashed.
Yeah, talk about making a difference. I was hired at NYU as a full professor with tenure, and that was what Washington did for me. And it made the most unbelievable difference. It was the first time in my life I had real security, real job security. It paid not an amazing salary, but enough of a salary to allow me to live in New York comfortably, because it came with an apartment, which I'm still living in. It was a platform. I never had that kind of platform before. And NYU is a very unusual place. You can pretty much do anything you want there if it's good for students, good for the university, and you can figure out how to pay for it. There weren't a lot of barriers to doing what I wanted to do. The kind of work that I was doing, didn't require a lot of money. It didn't require a lot of assistance. I was trying to push the department to become more research oriented because it was a university. That's what you're supposed to do. And that was not particularly easy, but it was clearly moving in that direction. And then when we had the opportunity when we were forced to find another field to replace a program that was taken away from us, we invented food studies. And that, of course, turned out to be just terrific, because we created the program that we wish we all could have been in. Years earlier, and that just turned out wonderfully. We were the only food studies program in the country when we started. There was a gastronomy program at Boston University that Julia Child had been involved in. But now I think every university in the world, certainly in the country, if it doesn't have a food studies program, it's certainly teaching courses about food. And that's a huge change. And it's not often that you get to create a new field of study. I'm still kind of awestruck.
That's so amazing. And your breakout book was Food Politics.
Yes.
What led to that, and why was it so successful?
Well, I can answer the first question much more easily than I can answer the second. I started writing articles about food industry marketing as a result of having gone to a conference on cigarette marketing and realizing that the parallels were very tight. And I started writing articles about various aspects of food marketing, the ways in which food companies were marketing to children, how they were marketing certain products. I don't know, there were a whole series of articles that came out from the early 90s until the late 90s. And I had a sabbatical coming up, and I thought I needed a project. I had finally figured out that NYU values books, that, I had grown up in science where books don't count, only papers and in prestigious science journals count. And I finally figured out that NYU valued books. I thought, well, I'll pull those articles together into a book. And that was the genesis of Food Politics. It came out in the spring of 2002. And I have to say, I had reasons for writing it. I was very tired of going to meetings about childhood obesity and hearing everybody say, how are we going to teach moms to feed their babies better and their kids better? And nobody was talking about the influence of food industry on what kids eat. I wanted that to change. I never wanted to go to another conference on child obesity without the subject of food industry marketing come up, because I thought it was really an important influence. I was concerned that the American Dietetic Association was publishing handouts that were sponsored by food companies that reflected the marketing interests of the food company, whether science backed it up or not. I wanted them to stop doing that. And then I wanted better lecture invitations. And all I can say is you have to be careful what you ask for, because boy, did I ever get them. And so the book came out, and it was controversial right from the beginning because a group of people wrote really nasty reviews of it on Amazon. And those reviews, there were 3 very nasty reviews. And then somebody came in and said, oh, look at all those. Somebody paid for those. If they're that upset about this book, it must be good. So that was nice. And then it was reviewed. I didn't understand. It was sort of my first, because the publisher of my first book went out of business so quickly. Afterwards, I didn't understand what it means, like what it meant to promote a book. And I did probably 100 radio interviews. I thought that was normal. Yeah, the book was reviewed in lots and lots and lots of places. I thought that was normal. It got a lot of attention, and I was surprised by the attention in a way, because I thought I was just describing what was out there, and that anybody who looked would have noticed it if they paid any attention to it. I thought I was stating the obvious, and instead it turned out to be the first book that really exposed what food companies were doing to try to sell their products and linked it to childhood and adult obesity and chronic disease. And I made that link very explicit. The second book came out a year later. That was Safe Food, which is about food safety and biotechnology. And then there was sort of one book after another over the next years. Slow Cooked, the memoir, is my 15th book.
Wow.
Either written, co-written, or edited.
The one last question is, what keeps you going? What drives you? Why didn't you just retire and live on the beach at age 66?
Well, I just love nutrition. I love the field. I love everything about it. I think food, nutrition, and public health are fascinating topics. They're in the press every day. I have the opportunity to write a daily blog at foodpolitics.com where I could say anything I want about anything, anytime I want. I haven't taught the last year, and I'm not sure whether I'm going to be teaching again, but I'm still dealing a lot with students. And I think this generation of students really gets it about what the real issues are with food and nutrition. There's always something going on that's really interesting. And I get called by reporters all the time. If I'm going to answer reporters' questions, I need to know what's going on. And I find that to be a real incentive. They send me papers to read. They ask me, what's going on with the White House conference? And I like to be able to answer questions like that.
It is September of 2022, and the book is available for pre-order, and it will ship in early October. Marion wanted me to let you know that there's a 30% off coupon if you order through the publisher, which I'll link in the description. Marion's emphasis on calories being the primary thing has really got me fascinated. One of the most respected diabetes researchers in the world is Roy Taylor, who has been able to conduct astounding experiments over his long career, showing that for type 2 diabetes, caloric intake is the #1 thing, and what you eat is #2 within reason. I'm on vacation with my family for a month, which keeps me very busy, but I'm going to steal away hours while they're sleeping to review a couple of Roy Taylor's books and explore that hypothesis of calories over what you eat. At least for type 2 diabetes, maybe I can get that done in the next few weeks.